Thank you to the sponsor of today's video, 𝗬𝗓. More on them in a little bit. Hi friends, in honor of the beginning of Pride Month, I wanted to do a deep dive into the history of the criminalization of cross-dressing and drag. And my god, this has been a wild journey filled with stories of people who really fucking went for it. Boldly expressed themselves in the face of social scorn, got arrested a bunch of times, and lived as authentically as they could, despite a whole world who told them they were wrong. It's also filled with stories of bigotry, hatred, and violence that I'm not sure we've moved on from as a society, but I'll get into that at the end. So here's a brief selection of the history of drag criminalization in America. Now, when I think of drag, I mainly think of, RuPaul's Drag Race, people dressing in hyper-feminine glamorous fashion, wearing a ton of makeup to try to feminize their face, but a lot of what I found were stories of female-bodied people dressing in masculine clothing and running into troubles with the law for it. Of course, probably the oldest and most famous instance of this is Joan of Arc, who was largely prosecuted and eventually executed because she refused to wear women's clothing. Okay, but that's France, and we're talking about US law. In the US, the earliest recorded instances of criminalized cross-dressing date back to the 1800s. New York was one of the earliest states to adopt laws criminalizing cross-dressing, but they weren't explicitly about cross-dressing. They were laws criminalizing vagrancy and masquerading. New York's law said every person who, having his face painted, discolored, covered, or concealed, or being otherwise disguised in a manner calculated to prevent him from being identified, shall appear in any road or public highway or in any field, lot, wood, or enclosure, may be pursued and arrested. This law was originally passed in response to anti-rent riots. Yes, even in the 1840s, people were rioting about high rent prices in New York. Google the anti-rent war. Though I also read the theory that the law was passed to punish rural farmers who had started dressing like Native Americans to scare off tax collectors. The point is that this law wasn't even written about cross-dressers, but it was twisted and used in order to criminalize a practice that society had deemed a sickness and a public offense. Reminder that homosexuality wasn't removed as a mental illness from the DSM until 1973, and it wasn't until 2019 that the World Health Organization quit classifying being trans as a disease. Just for some context. Anyway, so even though the laws weren't well tailored to the situation, it didn't matter. The cops and prosecutors and society still wanted to control people who didn't conform with the status quo of gender appropriateness. So they used the tools they had at their disposal. Okay, but there's another connection to these vagrancy laws in the 1800s, and that was the growing paranoia of people disguising their identity for nefarious reasons. What were those reasons, you might ask? Well, turns out enslaved black women would sometimes disguise themselves as men because even though black men were also controlled and criminalized, they still had greater mobility than black women. Enslaved men could travel more easily than enslaved women in general and could therefore escape more easily. Okay, the most iconic story that I read though was the story of Ellen Kraft in 1848. Before we get into that, I do want to thank the sponsor of today's video, 𝗬𝗓. 𝗬𝗓 is a new mindfulness and sleep app that won the Best of Apple award and is used by over 5 million people. 𝗬𝗓 has thousands of meditations, breath work, and so much more created by hundreds of expert coaches and therapists around the world. I'm excited to be working with 𝗬𝗓 as we kick off Pride Month, as studies show that those of us in the LGBTQ community tend to struggle with mental health, and I appreciate having 𝗬𝗓 as a tool in my toolbox that helps me manage my mental health. I love that 𝗬𝗓 provides a very personalized approach to mindfulness. It's like the Spotify for your mind. It knows I'm stressed as hell and suggests things like a 12-day stress relief program or a curated playlist called Your Stress Mix made for Leeja, because they know I need to be quieting my anxiety and panic on the daily. They also have these excellent soundscapes like tropical beach and mountain lake, where you can pick the length of time you want it to play up to 10 hours and just kick back and relax. It especially helps me when I have a lot of work to do and I just need to focus in while remaining cool, calm, and collected. I've also been trying for years to get better at mindfulness, as I know it's helpful for my mental health, and 𝗬𝗓's guided meditations and breathwork are great for that. 𝗬𝗓 truly is an all-in-one app for your well-being and sleep. You can get started completely free on 𝗬𝗓's website using my special link in the description, 𝗬𝗓health.io/LeejaMiller. The first 500 people to click that link get a free trial plus an exclusive extra 25% off. Thanks, 𝗬𝗓. So, Ellen Kraft, she was an enslaved woman in Georgia. You see, Ellen's father was the white man who owned her, and her skin was fair enough that she could pass as white, and was often mistaken as a white member of the family in whose house she was enslaved. Her husband, William, was a darker-skinned black man, and William had the absolutely brilliant idea for Ellen to dress up as a white man. And she made herself some pants, and they cut her hair, and she wore spectacles and a top hat hat. And they traveled from Georgia to Philadelphia over the course of 4 days, with Ellen posing as a white man and William as her slave. They put bandages around her face to hide the fact that she had no facial hair, and a sling on her arm so that as they traveled, she would appear to be disabled and wouldn't be asked to sign her name along the way, because her and William were illiterate. Absolute icons. Of course, this is very different from the drag we know today, but I wanted to tell that story because, again, it's iconic and also sheds light both on why the laws were written the way they were in the early 1800s, as well as the very real power, class, gender, and racial dynamics that create a very complex stew of issues when we talk about drag and drag criminalization. With, of course, Black women being the very bottom of the ladder. For example, when women started pushing for being able to wear pants, called the bloomerist movement, which is a fun name, their opponents told them that wearing pants made them look unfeminine and compared their bloomers to the clothing worn by enslaved women. When criminal records were taken and newspaper articles were written in the 1800s involving accounts of cross-dressing, the race of the person was only ever mentioned if that person was not white, with the very rare exception being if the white cross-dresser's character could be put into question by noting that they spent time with Black people. For example, in 1897 in Topeka, Kansas, police arrested 26-year-old female impersonator known as 𝗬𝗏. She would dress up in women's clothing and rob men. Again, an icon. And the paper described 𝗬𝗏 as a white man who lives with Negroes. However, on the other side of that was a trend where minstrel shows would perform satirized and Africanized opera shows in which white men would dress in drag as Black women. This was meant to be a comedy show, a circus performance, and not an expression of gender identity or liberation. And no record that I came across, at least, indicated that these white men were ever prosecuted under the vagrant or masquerading laws used to control gender variance. It is, however, an important point to make to again illustrate the complex ways that gender and race intertwine with the history of drag and cross-dressing. And while blackface has become a cultural taboo, scholars have drawn comparisons between the use of AAVE and minstrel shows, calling it modern-day minstrel, with many white folks in the drag and LGBTQ communities adopting the speech patterns of AAVE in ways that are often problematic. Again, it's complicated, my friends. Some states were a bit more explicit about their laws. In 1851, Chicago made it a criminal offense if anyone shall appear in a public place in a state of nudity or in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. This is another illustration of societal thinking around cross-dressing at the time. It was akin to and as inappropriate and vulgar as being just fully naked in public. And they wrote these laws because there were people genuinely breaking them, whether as an act of independence and rebellion or as a means of expressing their true gender identity. Between 1850 and 1906, the Chicago Tribune reported on at least 9 cases of female-bodied people being forced to leave the city for dressing as men, like fully kicked out of Chicago for wearing a suit. Despite this, cross-dressing and drag continued to exist in cities like Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, and probably elsewhere in the 1800s. In Chicago, the aldermen of the First Ward of Chicago, John Bathhouse John Coughlin and Michael Hinky-Dink-Kenna, were notoriously corrupt politicians in the late 1800s who were known for being charismatic and eccentric. John loved fashion and writing poetry and worked as a rubber at local bathhouses. Yes, that was an actual job. He rubbed people down in bathhouses, which is where he met many politicians that would help him gain influence in the richest ward in Chicago. Him and old Hinky Dink threw First Ward balls, annual political fundraisers which brought together absolutely everyone, including the seedy underbelly of late 1800s Chicago. Politicians, businessmen, sex workers, gamblers, and you guessed it, drag queens and cross-dressers. It was eventually banned in 1909, but by that time it had gotten so big that it was held in the Chicago Coliseum. Each ball often ended with the police having to be called to curb disorderly conduct bordering on rioting. So there was some gentle state-sanctioned cross-dressing, so long as they were sanctioned by the right people with power and influence. Another iconic figure in cross-dressing criminality is Dr. Mary Walker, who was arrested at least 7 times for wearing pants in Kansas City, New York, New Orleans, Baltimore, Providence, and Chicago. She wore pants under her skirt and a man's coat to her own wedding in 1856, and refused to take her husband's last name, and demanded that the words "to obey" be removed from her vows. She received a Congressional Medal of Honor for serving as a surgeon during the Civil War, and Congress actually awarded her specifically the right to wear men's clothing after the war. So it appears you could cross-dress if, again, you had the right connections and enough prestige. And in San Francisco, home to the Gold Rush, the Wild West, the place where they did things a little differently and were a little less puritanical than their eastern neighbors, drag and cross-dressing was actually an accepted type of performance art. Vaudeville became wildly popular at the end of the 1800s, awards, and the people who commanded the highest salaries and received top billing, drew the biggest crowds, drag queens, or female impersonators they were called. Unlike the minstrel shows I mentioned before, these vaudeville stars didn't don women's clothing as a joke. They were trying to convincingly imitate women to pass. Audiences would pack vaudeville houses to see the latest fashions, knowing that the women who were modeling them were male-bodied. And these female impersonators were marketed as wholesome family entertainment suitable for middle-class women and children. All the while, people were being arrested for cross-dressing in the streets of San Francisco. That's right, in 1863, San Francisco passed a law that criminalized appearing in public in a dress not belonging to his or her sex. How is this contradiction possible? Well, the vaudevillian impersonators followed strict gender norms when they performed. Female impersonators acted as pious, gentle, modest women, and male impersonators filled the masculine role expected of men. And off the stage, these impersonators fulfilled their assigned gender roles, projecting a heterosexual masculine persona off stage to counter their female impersonation on stage, or being docile and devoted wives off stage while being masculine male impersonators on stage. Impersonators were seen in the same light as magicians like Houdini, capable of creating a magic transformation from male to female. In that way, the impersonators continued to adhere to strict gender norms, and their performance was seen as a feat of imitation, a trick of the eye, and not an expression of the self. There were, of course, grittier and raunchier underground theaters where the lines between the street and the stage were blurred in a way that society associated with sexual and gender transgressions. And these people most often bore the brunt of the criminalization of cross-dressing in late 1800s San Francisco. There's a book that goes even deeper into the cross-dressing culture in San Francisco that I can't wait to read. It's called Arresting Dress, and it's by Claire Sears, who's a PhD candidate studying LGBTQ history and the law, which is frankly just about the most interesting thing I've ever heard of, okay? And y'all, these vagrancy laws aren't a relic of the 1800s. The New York vagrancy law we talked about was used to prosecute trans folks, drag queens, cross-dressers, and the like until as recently as 1968, in the case People v. Archibald. In April 1967, Mauricio Archibald went to a masquerade party dressed in drag. I wasn't able to figure out what pronouns Mauricio actually used, so we'll just use they, them to be respectful. All right, so Mauricio was standing on a New York subway platform with a few other folks at 4 a.m. having left this masquerade party, and a cop was clearly eyeing the group, so Mauricio turned around and gave the officer a little wink, which is funny. Obviously, the cop's masculinity had been threatened, so he came up to the group, questioned whether Mauricio was a boy or a girl, and when Mauricio responded, "I'm a girl," the officer arrested them and charged them with being a vagrant. Mauricio was tried and convicted of being a vagrant, which they appealed up to the New York Appellate Court, arguing that they weren't a vagrant because they had a visible means of supporting themselves, and despite being cross-dressed, they had no intention of committing any illegal act. One judge agreed, saying that if the law applies outside of those seeking to commit crimes, then circus clowns, strangely attired hippies, flowing-haired yippies, and even people who would indulge in the Halloween tradition of trick-or-treat, ipso facto may be targets for criminal sanctions as vagrants. But unfortunately for Mauricio, the other two judges on that 3-judge panel said, nah, it was right to convict Mauricio, because this 1840s vagrant law had been updated since then with a more modern aim to discourage overt homosexuality in public places, which is offensive to public morality. And the appellate court upheld Mauricio's conviction. The timing was pretty bad for Mauricio as well, because that same year, New York repealed the part of the vagrancy laws that had been applied to cross-dressers. But Mauricio's act occurred before the new law applied. The new laws, however, didn't decriminalize cross-dressing in New York. In fact, there were new laws that were more explicitly aimed at the gays and the theys, saying that a bar or club could be closed and patrons arrested if a single person inside was deemed to be cross-dressed. This was a sneaky way to make bar and club owners police their own patrons under the fear of being shuttered by this law. There was also an anti-mask criminal law in New York, making a crime the wearing of a mask or disguises by 3 or more persons in a public place, clearly meant to penalize places where trans folks, drag queens, and cross-dressers gathered. Decriminalization of cross-dressing in New York was achieved a few years later in 1971, in part due to the activist work of Lee Brewster, founder of the Queens Liberation Front and publisher of Drag, a trans publication that ran for 10 years. He also organized drag balls and was the proprietor of the drag emporium Lee's Mardi Gras, which was in business around Manhattan for 30 years. And just so we're clear, when Lee was organizing drag balls, speaking out in support of the drag community, and mounting legal challenges to New York's anti-trans and anti-drag laws, public cross-dressing was frowned upon by many LGBTQ organizations at the time, including the Lesbian Feminist Liberation Group. A fun reminder that TERFs are everywhere and we must be ever vigilant. All right, and that's just a very brief overview of Lee Brewster's life and work. I highly recommend you do a thorough Googling because this video alone couldn't do him justice. While bans on cross-dressing blanketed most, if not all, of the United States throughout the 1800s and 1900s, after the Stonewall riots in 1969, arrests for cross-dressing, at least in New York, went down dramatically. And in the years since that time, most states have removed their anti-cross-dressing statutes. Though I did see a headline from like last year about a Missouri lawmaker proposing a bill to criminalize public library drag queen story hours, because apparently men dressed up in costumes and reading books to children is inappropriate. However, now performing in drag is largely celebrated and has launched fabulous careers and has created worldwide fandoms. That being said, I was really struck by the similarity between San Francisco vaudeville stars who made fortunes and rose to prominence while cross-dressers were regularly arrested in the streets in the late 1800s. Now we have drag queens going on world tours and making millions while legislative bodies are actively passing bills policing trans people, adults and children, on everything from bathroom usage to their participation in sports and beyond. Drag queens sit on floats for pride parades while trans folks are being targeted and killed in the streets, with studies showing staggering numbers of suicides and attempted suicides among the trans community. I think it comes down to, in part, the same thing that made vaudeville performers acceptable in 1800 San Francisco. We see drag queens as putting on a costume and not necessarily as an authentic expression of gender identity and of the self. And by we, I mean society at large. We're able to neatly categorize them as women and use the universal she pronouns when they're in drag. That's of course not to say that drag queens don't experience violence, oppression, and mental health issues in and out of drag, as many queens are trans and gender non-conforming outside of drag. But what does it say about how our society works that a trans woman who's performing on stage in drag is more acceptable than the trans woman as herself walking down the street? Like, nothing's really changed since the 1800s. Criminalization of cross-dressing has become a thing of the past in name only, really, and society at large is still seeking out ways to control and criminalize people who do not stick to strict gender expression. Thanks once again to the sponsor of today's video, Ora. A reminder that the first 500 people who click the link in the description will get a free trial and an exclusive 25% off. Thanks, Ora. If you like this video, you might like this other video where I talk about the Drag Race Golden Ticket and the surprising history of game show scandals. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.